The storm carried more than rain and thunder. It carried the scent of destiny. Cast out by her own family, she hid in the forest as her eyes shifted from green to fierce amber. In the depths of the mountains, a wounded man awaited her arrival. The storm that tore through the Shadowmere Mountains that night carried more than rain and thunder. It carried the scent of destiny, though Serena couldn't have known it as she pressed her back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, her chest heaving with exhaustion and terror. Her golden hair, now darkened with mud and rainwater, clung to her face as her eyes shifted from their usual emerald green to a fierce amber that glowed in the darkness like twin flames. Monster. Her brother's voice echoed in her mind, the word cutting deeper than any blade ever could. You've cursed this family long enough. The memory of their faces, twisted with disgust and fear as they cast her out, burned behind her closed eyelids. 22 years of life, and she had never belonged anywhere. Not in the stone cottage where she was raised, not among the villagers who crossed themselves when she passed, and certainly not in the world of normal people who didn't cause milk to sour with their tears or make flowers bloom out of season with their touch. Lightning split the sky above the dense canopy, illuminating the forest in stark, violent flashes. Each boom of thunder made her flinch, but she couldn't return to the ramshackle cabin she'd built with her own hands deep in these woods. Not tonight. Not when her emotions were this raw, this dangerous. The last time she'd lost control like this, every glass object in a 3-mile radius had shattered simultaneously. Her bare feet, toughened by months of walking on forest floors, found purchase on the slippery leaves as she stumbled forward. The medicinal herbs in her woven basket had scattered when she'd fled her memories, but she couldn't bring herself to care. What was the point of gathering healing plants when she was the thing that needed to be cured, when she was the sickness that had plagued her family for generations? Every misfortune that's befallen us can be traced back to the day you were born, her mother had said that morning, her voice cold as winter frost. The failed harvests, your father's accident, your sister's fever that nearly killed her, all of it started with you. Serena's hands trembled as she remembered the way they'd looked at her, as if she were something feral that had wandered into their home. The basket slipped from her fingers entirely now, tumbling into the mud as her knees gave out. She sank to the forest floor, her body racked with sobs that seemed to tear themselves from her very soul. The rain intensified, each drop feeling like a judgment from the heavens above. But as she knelt there in her anguish, something else reached her senses. A scent that didn't belong to the storm or the earth or the familiar wildness of her forest sanctuary. This was different, dangerous. It carried undertones of leather and steel, of battlefields and authority, of something fundamentally other than human. Her head snapped up, amber eyes scanning the darkness with predatory alertness. Years of living alone had honed her instincts to razor sharpness, and every one of them now screamed that she was no longer alone in these woods. The very air seemed to thicken with an presence so powerful it made her skin prickle with electricity that had nothing to do with the lightning above. A groan, low and pained, drifted through the storm from somewhere to her left. Serena froze, torn between the instinct to flee and something deeper, more primal, that urged her toward the sound. Her enhanced hearing, one of the many gifts that had marked her as different, picked up the subtle rhythm of labored breathing beneath the drumming rain. Someone was hurt, badly. Her bare feet made no sound as she crept through the underbrush, following that strange, compelling scent. What she found made her breath catch in her throat and her heart stutter against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. A man lay crumpled against the base of a massive pine tree, his dark clothing torn and stained with blood that looked black in the storm's shadow. But even unconscious and wounded, there was nothing vulnerable about him. Power radiated from his motionless form like heat from a forge, and Serena found herself stepping closer despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were. sharp cheekbones carved from marble, lips that spoke of both cruelty and passion, and dark hair that fell across his forehead in waves. But it was the scars that truly caught her attention. They mapped his visible skin like a constellation of violence, each one telling a story of battles fought and survived. These weren't the random marks of accident or misfortune. They were deliberate, earned. A warrior then. But what was a warrior doing bleeding in her forest? Lightning flashed again, and in that brilliant instant, Serena saw his face clearly for the first time. Her world tilted on its axis. Even in unconsciousness, his features held an authority that made her want to bow her head in instinctive submission, though she'd never bowed to anyone in her life. There was something about his presence that called to the deepest part of her soul, to places she hadn't even known existed. Another pained sound escaped his lips, and the spell broke. Whatever he was, whoever he was dying. And Serena had never been able to ignore suffering, no matter how much her own pain demanded attention. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his wounded form. This close, his scent was overwhelming, filling her lungs with something that tasted like moonlight and violence and ancient promises. Her eyes shifted again, the amber deepening to molten gold as unknown instincts stirred within her. "What are you?" she whispered to the storm, her voice barely audible above the thunder. As if in answer, his eyes opened. They were silver, not grey, not blue, but true silver, like polished metal. And they fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them moved. The rain continued to fall, but it seemed muted now, as if the very world had paused to witness this meeting. Then his hand, scarred and powerful despite his injuries, rose to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and where he touched, warmth bloomed beneath her skin, like spring flowers pushing through winter snow. "Angel," he breathed, his voice rough with pain, but carrying an undertone of such raw command that it made her shiver. "Have I died?" The question broke something loose inside her chest. When had anyone ever looked at her like she was something precious instead of something to be feared? When had anyone's touch brought comfort instead of flinching away? "You're hurt," she managed, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when everything inside her was trembling. "Let me help you." His silver eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he were cataloging every feature, every emotion, every secret she'd ever tried to hide. Then impossibly, his lips curved in a smile that transformed his harsh features into something breathtaking. "I don't think I've ever needed help less," he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he meant more than just his physical wounds. But even as he spoke, his body betrayed him. His hand fell from her face as weakness claimed him, and his silver eyes fluttered closed once more. The authority that had radiated from him flickered like a candle in wind, and suddenly he was just a man, a wounded, bleeding man who would die if she didn't act. Serena had carried injured animals to her cabin before, but never anything like this. He was tall and broad-shouldered, built like the warriors from the old stories her grandmother used to tell. Getting him to shelter would be nearly impossible, but the alternative was unthinkable. Something deep within her, some instinct she'd never felt before, recoiled at the thought of leaving him here to die. "You're coming with me," she told his unconscious form, surprised by the fierce protectiveness that colored her words. "I don't care what you are or what you've done. No one dies alone in my forest." The journey back to her cabin tested every ounce of strength she possessed. He was heavy as stone and twice as solid, but somehow she managed to drag him through the storm, pausing frequently to check that he still breathed. Each time her fingers found the steady pulse at his throat, something inside her settled, as if his heartbeat had become necessary for her own peace of mind. Her cabin, built from salvaged wood and sheer determination, had never felt smaller. By the light of her oil lamp, his presence filled the single room completely, making her feel like a mouse in the den of some great predator. But as she worked to clean his wounds, her healer's instincts took over, pushing aside her nervousness. The cuts were deep but clean, made by something sharp and precise, claws perhaps, or talons. But what creature in these mountains could have wounded someone who radiated such lethal competence? And why did touching his skin send jolts of electricity up her arms that had nothing to do with her unstable powers? As she worked, cleaning and binding his wounds with strips torn from her only good dress, he began to fever. His body burned like a forge, hot enough that sweat beaded on her forehead despite the storm's chill. But it was when the fever dreams took him that Serena truly began to understand what she'd brought into her sanctuary. He spoke in his sleep, his voice carrying tones of absolute command, even in delirium. Names she didn't recognize fell from his lips, along with strategic discussions of territories and boundaries, of challenges and blood rights. But it was the growls that made her blood run cold. Low, rumbling sounds that no human throat should have been able to produce. "The northern packs grow restless," he muttered, his body twisting against her rough blankets. "Marcus thinks he can challenge me. Let him try, let them all try." Serena's hands stilled on the bandage she was tying. Packs. He'd said packs, not groups or clans. And the way he'd said Marcus's name with such casual dismissal of a threat suggested a hierarchy she was only beginning to comprehend. A memory surfaced from her childhood, a story her grandmother had whispered during long winter nights. Tales of the old times, when the mountains were ruled not by men, but by creatures that wore human faces but carried the souls of wolves. Shapeshifters who formed packs bound by blood and dominance, led by alphas whose word was absolute law. Legends. Nothing more than stories to frighten children and explain away things that couldn't be understood. But as she looked at the man fevering in her bed, at the scars that mapped his skin like a history of violence, at the way even unconscious he seemed to command the very air around him, those childhood stories felt suddenly terrifyingly real. "What have I done?" she whispered to the storm, still raging outside her walls. As if summoned by her words, his silver eyes opened once more, fixing on her face with perfect clarity despite the fever. And when he spoke, his voice carried such quiet authority that it seemed to resonate in her very bones. "You've saved the life of someone who could destroy you without a second thought," he said, his words cutting through her like blades. "The question is, little healer, do you have the courage to live with the consequences?" Before she could answer, before she could even process the implications of what he'd said, his eyes closed again, leaving her alone with questions that had no safe answers, and a growing certainty that her life would never be the same again. The storm outside began to quiet, but the tempest in her heart had only just begun. Dawn broke over the Shadowmere Mountains with the kind of crystalline clarity that only followed violent storms. Serena had not slept. She sat curled in her single wooden chair, watching the rise and fall of her mysterious patient's chest, memorizing the harsh beauty of his face in the pale morning light. Every few minutes, she would catch herself leaning forward, drawn by some inexplicable need to be closer to him, only to force herself back with growing unease. He had been unconscious for hours now, his fever finally breaking just before sunrise. But even in sleep, he dominated her small space completely. The cabin that had been her sanctuary for months now felt like a cage, and she was beginning to understand that she was not the one holding the key. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap into her throat. No one came to her cabin. No one even knew where it was, hidden as it was in the deepest part of the forest where normal people feared to tread. She crept to the window, peering through a gap in the rough wooden shutters, and felt her blood turn to ice. 3 men stood outside her door, but they were unlike any villagers she had ever seen. They moved with the fluid grace of predators, their heads turning in perfect unison as they scanned the surrounding forest. Even from a distance, she could see that their eyes held the same unnatural intensity as her patient's, though theirs burned gold rather than silver. The largest of the three stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried clearly through the morning air, despite its conversational tone. "We know you're in there, little healer, and we know you're not alone." His accent was cultured, educated, but there was something underneath it that made her skin crawl. "We've come for our Alpha. Release him to us, and no harm will come to you." Alpha. The word hit her like a physical blow, confirming suspicions she had desperately hoped were just fever-induced paranoia. Behind her, she heard the soft rustle of blankets and turned to find silver eyes watching her with perfect awareness. "Don't." His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried such absolute command that she found herself freezing in place. "Don't let them see you." "They know I'm here," she whispered back, her hands trembling as she gripped the windowsill. "They suspect. There's a difference." He was trying to sit up, and she could see the effort it cost him. Fresh blood seeped through the bandages she had so carefully applied. "How long have I been here?" "Since last night. You were dying." Something flickered across his features, an expression too complex to decipher. "And you saved me." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. In all her years of tending to injured creatures, no one had ever asked her why. "Because you needed help. Because no one should die alone." "Even monsters?" The word hung between them like a blade. Outside, the voices grew more insistent, though she noticed they made no move to force entry. They were waiting for something, or someone. "I don't know what you are," she said finally, meeting his silver gaze without flinching. "But I know what I saw in your eyes last night. You're many things, but you're not a monster." His laugh was soft and entirely without humor. "Sweet little healer, you have no idea what I'm capable of." Another voice joined the chorus outside, this one younger but carrying an edge of barely controlled violence. "Marcus grows impatient, Darius. The sun rises and the pack stirs. How much longer will you hide behind human skirts?" Darius. So that was his name. It suited him, she thought distantly, even as the implications of what she was hearing crashed over her like a tide. The man in her bed, the wounded stranger she had nursed through the night, was not just any shapeshifter. He was their leader, their alpha. And from the sound of it, his authority was being challenged. "I have to go to them," he said, though she could see the reluctance in every line of his body. "This is pack business, and it concerns you now whether you wish it or not." "What do you mean it concerns me?" But he was already rising, ignoring her protests and the obvious pain each movement caused him. In the pale morning light, she could see the full extent of the damage he had sustained. Claw marks raked across his chest and shoulders, a deep gash along his ribs, and dozens of smaller cuts that spoke of a prolonged and vicious fight. Yet as he stood, something seemed to settle around him like an invisible mantle. The casual authority she had glimpsed in his fever dreams solidified into something tangible, transforming him from wounded man to something far more dangerous. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice carrying tones that made her want to obey without question. "No matter what you hear, do not come out until I tell you it's safe." He moved toward the door with predatory grace, and Serena felt panic rise in her throat. "Wait, you're still hurt. You need rest, time to heal properly." He paused with his hand on the crude wooden latch, turning to look at her over his shoulder. The smile that curved his lips was sharp enough to cut, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of the predator that lived beneath his human skin. "Little healer," he said, his voice soft as silk and twice as dangerous, "there are some wounds that can only be healed with blood." The door opened, and morning light flooded her cabin as Darius stepped outside. Serena pressed herself against the window, peering through the shutters to watch what unfolded in her small clearing. The three men waiting for him arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, their postures respectful but tense. The largest, the one who had spoken first, stepped forward with a slight bow that somehow managed to convey both deference and challenge. "Alpha," he said, the title carrying subtle mockery. "We were beginning to worry. It's not like you to simply vanish in the middle of a hunt. Marcus." Darius's voice carried no warmth, no familiarity, despite the obvious history between them. "I wasn't aware that my whereabouts required your approval. When your absence leaves the pack leaderless in enemy territory, it becomes everyone's concern." Marcus's eyes flickered toward the cabin, and Serena shrank back instinctively, especially when that absence involves complications. The tension in the clearing ratcheted higher, and Serena found herself holding her breath. Even through the wooden walls, she could feel the weight of unspoken threats, the careful dance of predators testing each other's limits. "Choose your next words, very carefully," Darius said, and there was something in his tone that made the hair on Serena's arms stand on end. "You seem to be implying that I've been derelict in my duties." "Not derelict, distracted." Marcus gestured toward the cabin again, more deliberately this time. "By things that have no place in pack business." The silence that followed was so absolute that Serena could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. When Darius finally spoke, his words were soft as a whisper and 10 times more deadly. "Are you challenging me, Marcus?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Through her window, Serena watched as the three men tensed, their bodies coiling like springs ready to unleash violence. But it was the change in Darius that truly terrified her. Power rolled off him in waves, an almost visible aura that made the very air shimmer with heat. His silver eyes began to glow within a fire, and she could swear she saw his canine teeth elongate into something altogether more dangerous. "I'm saying," Marcus replied carefully, "that the pack needs to know its alpha's priorities lie with them, not with whatever human pet he's collected." The last word was barely out of his mouth before Darius moved. Serena had never seen anything so fast, so fluid, so utterly inhuman. One moment he stood 10 feet away from Marcus. The next, his hand was wrapped around the other man's throat, lifting him clear off the ground with impossible strength. "Let me make something perfectly clear," Darius said conversationally, as if he weren't currently strangling a man twice his size with one hand. "What I do, where I go, and who I choose to associate with are not subjects for pack discussion. They never have been and they never will be." Marcus clawed at the hand around his throat, his face turning an alarming shade of purple, but Darius continued speaking in that same reasonable tone. "Furthermore, if I hear you or anyone else refer to her as a pet again, I will tear your tongue out and feed it to the crows. Are we understanding each other?" He released Marcus suddenly, letting the larger man drop to the forest floor where he landed in a gasping, wheezing heap. The other two stepped forward as if to help their fallen companion, but a single look from Darius froze them in place. "Good," Darius said, smoothing down his torn shirt as if nothing had happened. "Now report. What happened after I left the hunt?" It took Marcus several minutes to recover his voice, and when he did, all traces of challenge had vanished from his tone. "The Raven Crest pack retreated to their territory. They took their dead with them. Casualties on our side, 3 injured, none killed. And their alpha? Did Constantine show himself, or did he send his dogs to do his fighting for him?" "He was there." This came from one of the other men, a younger wolf with nervous eyes. "He asked about you specifically, wanted to know if the rumors were true." Darius went very still, and Serena felt the temperature in the clearing drop several degrees. "What rumors?" The nervous wolf glanced at Marcus, who was still massaging his throat. "Rumors that you've been changed, weakened. They say you've found a mate and that she's made you soft." The laugh that escaped Darius was like breaking glass, sharp and cutting, and utterly without warmth. "Let me guess. Constantine thinks that if I'm distracted by a woman, now would be an excellent time to press his territorial claims." "Something like that, yes." "Interesting." Darius began to pace, his movements carrying a restless energy that made Serena think of caged lightning. And what does the pack think of these rumors? The silence that greeted this question was answer enough. Through her window, Serena watched as Darius stopped pacing, his silver eyes scanning each of his subordinates with predatory intensity. "I see," he said finally. "Well, gentlemen, allow me to put your fears to rest. I'm exactly as dangerous as I have always been. The only difference is that now I have something to protect, which makes me infinitely more motivated to ensure that threats are eliminated permanently." He turned toward the cabin then, and Serena jerked back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Had he seen her watching? Did he know she had witnessed his casual display of lethal violence? "I'll be returning to pack territory within the hour," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the morning air. "Marcus, you'll inform the council that I'm calling a gathering for tonight. Full moon protocols. Every pack member in attendance." What will you tell them? The truth. There was something in Darius's tone that made Serena's blood run cold. "That anyone who mistakes my current contentment for weakness will learn exactly how wrong they are." Footsteps approached the cabin door, and Serena scrambled away from the window, pressing herself against the far wall as if she could somehow disappear into the rough wooden planks. The door opened without ceremony, and Darius stepped inside, closing it firmly behind him. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the small space. His silver eyes seemed to see everything, cataloguing her pale face, her trembling hands, the fear she couldn't quite hide despite her best efforts. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. "I heard enough." Her voice came out smaller than she intended, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're their leader, their alpha, and they think I'm making you weak. Are you?" The question caught her off guard. "What? Are you making me weak?" He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the predatory gleam in his silver eyes, the way his nostrils flared slightly as he inhaled her scent. "Because that's what they're afraid of, little healer, that I'll choose you over them." "That's ridiculous. We barely know each other." "Do we?" He was close enough now that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could count every silver fleck in his inhuman eyes. "Tell me, what did you feel when you first saw me bleeding in your forest?" The memory hit her like a physical blow, the inexplicable pull she had felt, the way her very soul had seemed to recognize him despite never having seen his face before, the protective instinct that had overridden every ounce of common sense she possessed. "I felt," she began, then stopped, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter what I felt. It's the only thing that matters." His hand rose to cup her cheek, just as it had the night before, and she felt that same electric warmth bloom beneath her skin. "Do you know what you are, Serena?" She started at the sound of her name on his lips, though she couldn't remember telling him what it was. "I'm no one, nothing. Just a girl who was thrown away because her family didn't want her." "Your family?" His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she shivered at the gentle touch. "Tell me about them." "There's nothing to tell. They're normal people living normal lives, and I'm not. I never was." "What makes you different?" The question she had been dreading, the one she had never been able to answer satisfactorily. How could she explain the way her eyes changed color with her emotions, the way her hair grew inches overnight during certain phases of the moon, the way she could sense the health of every living thing within a mile radius? "I don't know," she whispered. "I just am. Show me." "What?" "Your difference. Show me what makes you so dangerous that your own family cast you out." Serena stared at him in shock. "I can't. I don't. When I lose control, bad things happen. I'm not afraid of bad things, little healer. Show me." There was something in his voice, a note of command that bypassed her conscious mind and spoke directly to something deeper. Before she could think better of it, she was reaching for the part of herself she kept locked away, the wild thing that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. Her eyes shifted first, the green bleeding away until they blazed with golden fire. Then her hair began to move as if stirred by an unfelt wind, growing longer, thicker, until it fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. But it was the power that truly revealed her difference. It poured from her in waves, calling to every living thing in the forest beyond her walls. Through the window, she could see flowers beginning to bloom out of season, vines unfurling with impossible speed. The very trees seeming to lean toward her cabin as if drawn by an irresistible force. And in the center of it all stood Darius, watching her transformation with an expression of such intense satisfaction that it made her knees weak. "Beautiful," he breathed, his silver eyes reflecting her golden fire. "Do you know what you are now?" She shook her head, afraid to trust her voice. "You're mine," he said simply, as if stating an immutable law of nature. "You always have been. The question is, are you brave enough to claim what belongs to you in return?" But before she could answer, before she could even process what he was offering, the sound of howls began to echo through the morning air. Dozens of them, rising from every direction, converging on her hidden sanctuary with purpose that chilled her to the bone. The howls grew closer, a symphony of violence that seemed to make the very air vibrate with menace. Serena's newfound power flickered and died as fear crashed over her like a cold wave, her eyes fading back to their natural green, even as her hair settled around her shoulders in confused tangles. "How many?" Darius asked Marcus through the still open door, his voice carrying the calm of a seasoned warrior assessing a battlefield. "At least 30. Constantine brought half his pack." Marcus had recovered from his earlier humiliation, his professional demeanor restored in the face of genuine threat. "They're surrounding us. No escape routes." Darius nodded, as if this were exactly what he had expected. "Good. I was hoping he'd be foolish enough to bring sufficient numbers for a proper demonstration." "A demonstration of what?" Serena whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know the answer. His silver eyes found hers across the small space, and the smile that curved his lips made her blood run both hot and cold simultaneously. "Of what happens to anyone who threatens what's mine." Before she could ask what he meant, he was moving again with that inhuman speed. But instead of heading for the door, he came to her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible given the violence crackling in the air around them. "Listen to me very carefully, little healer," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What's about to happen will be brutal. These wolves haven't come to talk or negotiate. They've come to kill me and anyone they perceive as a threat to their territorial ambitions. Then we have to run, hide. There has to be somewhere." "No." The single word cut through her panic like a blade. "I don't run, and I don't hide. Not from Constantine, not from anyone. But I need to know you'll be safe while I handle this." "I won't leave you." The words surprised them both. Serena had spoken without thinking, driven by the same inexplicable instinct that had made her tend his wounds the night before. The idea of abandoning him to face this threat alone was physically painful, as if someone were trying to tear pieces from her soul. "You don't understand what you're saying," Darius said, though something in his expression suggested he understood perfectly. "This isn't going to be a civilized confrontation. When we change, when the wolf takes over, there's no reasoning with us. We become pure instinct, pure violence. You could be hurt. I could be hurt anywhere," she pointed out, surprised by her own steadiness. "At least here, I'm with you." The look he gave her then was so intense, it nearly stopped her heart. For a moment, she saw past the predator, past the alpha, to something raw and desperate that he normally kept hidden beneath layers of authority and control. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said finally. "Then show me." The howls were close enough now that she could distinguish individual voices, and through her enhanced senses, she caught something that made her stomach clench with dread. These weren't just the sounds of approaching wolves. They were hunting calls, coordinated and precise, the kind used to drive prey toward waiting jaws. They're not just surrounding us, she realized aloud. They're herding us, forcing us into a specific position. Darius's head snapped toward her, his silver eyes sharpening with sudden attention. What did you say? The pattern of their calls. I can hear... She paused, trying to find words for the knowledge that seemed to flow directly into her consciousness. They're coming from the north and east, but not the south or west. They want us to run toward the clearing where the old oak stands. The ritual ground, Marcus breathed from the doorway, his face gone pale. Son of a bitch, they're planning to challenge you on consecrated ground. If you fall there, the pack bonds transfer automatically to the victor, Darius finished grimly. Clever. Constantine always was more intelligent than his brutality suggested. Serena felt something cold settle in her stomach. What does that mean? It means, Darius said, his voice carrying a note of grim satisfaction that she didn't understand, that he's just made this much easier for me. Before she could ask what he meant, he was moving toward the door, his entire demeanor shifting as he prepared for battle. But as he reached the threshold, he turned back to her one final time. Serena, he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a promise combined. Whatever happens in the next hour, remember this: you are not cursed, you are not a mistake, and you are not alone. You are exactly what you were meant to be, exactly when you were meant to be it. Then he was gone, stepping into the morning sunlight with Marcus and the other wolves at his flanks. Through her window, Serena watched as they arranged themselves in a loose formation, their bodies already beginning to change in preparation for what was to come. The transformation was nothing like the fairy tales had described. There was no Hollywood magic, no cinematic morphing. Instead, it was raw and primal and utterly terrifying. Bones cracked and reformed, muscles bulged and shifted, and human skin gave way to thick, coarse fur in shades ranging from silver to black to deep brown. But it was Darius's change that truly took her breath away. Where the others became large wolves, impressive but still recognizably canine, he became something else entirely. His wolf form was massive, easily twice the size of the others, with silver fur that seemed to catch and reflect light like polished metal. But it was his eyes that remained unchanged, those impossible silver orbs that marked him as something beyond ordinary shapeshifter. The clearing filled with the sounds of approach, and within moments, they were surrounded. The Ravencrest pack emerged from the forest in perfect synchronization, 30 wolves moving with military precision under the command of their alpha. Constantine was easy to identify. Like Darius, his wolf form was larger than those of his subordinates. Though still smaller than the Supreme Alpha's massive frame, his coat was pure black, except for a streak of silver that ran from his snout to his tail, and his yellow eyes burned with ambition and hatred in equal measure. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the two packs faced each other across Serena's small clearing. The morning air was thick with tension, and the scent of impending violence, and even through her cabin walls, she could feel the weight of supernatural power pressing against her consciousness. Then Constantine threw back his massive head and howled, a sound that seemed to contain all the fury and bloodlust in the world. It was answered immediately by his pack, 30 voices raised in a harmony of menace that made the trees themselves seem to lean away in fear. But when Darius responded, his howl was different. Where Constantine's call had been full of rage and challenge, Darius's carried something deeper: authority, command, the absolute certainty of a predator who had never known defeat and never intended to learn. The sound rolled across the mountains like thunder, and Serena watched in amazement as Constantine's pack actually took a step backward, their formation wavering for just a moment before their alpha's snarled command restored their cohesion. Then the battle began. Serena had witnessed violence before, had seen the aftermath of territorial disputes between normal animals, but nothing had prepared her for the coordinated savagery of two werewolf packs in full combat. It wasn't a brawl or a melee, it was a tactical engagement where every movement had purpose, and every strike was calculated for maximum damage. Marcus and the other two wolves from Darius's pack held the flanks, their movements coordinated with military precision as they prevented Constantine's forces from surrounding their alpha. But the real battle was between the two leaders, a dance of death that seemed to make the very air crackle with supernatural energy. Constantine was fast and cunning, using his pack's numerical advantage to force Darius into defensive positions. But where the challenger relied on strategy and overwhelming force, Darius fought with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to violence. Every movement was economical, every strike precise. He wasted no energy on flashy displays or intimidation tactics. Instead, he moved through Constantine's attacks like smoke, always exactly where he needed to be, never where his enemies expected him. But as the battle wore on, Serena could see the toll it was taking. Darius was outnumbered 10-1, and despite his superior skill, the sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. Fresh blood matted his silver fur, and his movements, while still deadly, were becoming fractionally slower. It was when one of Constantine's wolves managed to rake claws across Darius's ribs that something inside Serena snapped. She had spent 22 years being told she was dangerous, that her very existence brought misfortune to those around her. Her family had cast her out, villagers had crossed themselves when she passed, and even she had begun to believe that she was some kind of walking curse. But watching Darius fight for his life, seeing the blood that flowed from wounds earned protecting her sanctuary, she finally understood what her grandmother had tried to tell her in those old stories. Power wasn't about what you could destroy. It was about what you chose to protect. The change that came over her was nothing like the gentle transformation Darius had coaxed from her earlier. This was raw and primal and utterly without restraint. Her eyes blazed with golden fire, bright enough to make the morning sun seem dim, and her hair whipped around her face as if caught in a hurricane that touched nothing else. But it was the power itself that truly marked her as something beyond human understanding. It poured from her in waves, calling to every living thing within miles. The trees began to grow, their branches extending toward the battle with obvious intent. Vines erupted from the forest floor, thick as a man's arm and strong as steel cables. Even the grass beneath the combatants' feet began to grow with supernatural speed, reaching up to entangle enemy wolves while carefully avoiding Darius and his allies. Through her window, she saw Constantine's pack falter as the very forest turned against them. But it was when she stepped outside, power radiating from her like heat from a forge, that the true extent of her abilities became clear. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with impossible volume and authority. Every wolf, friend and enemy alike, stopped mid-attack and turned to stare at her. But it was Constantine's reaction that truly revealed what she had become. The massive black wolf actually lowered his head in instinctive submission, his yellow eyes wide with something that might have been recognition. "You," he said, his mental voice carrying a note of awe that bordered on reverence. "The prophecies spoke true. The healer has awakened." Darius, still in his wolf form, but no longer engaged in combat, moved to stand between Serena and the Ravencrest pack. Even injured and outnumbered, his protective instincts remained absolute. "Mine," he said, the single word carrying tones of possession and promise that made Serena's knees weak despite the power flowing through her. "Not anymore," Constantine replied, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "The healer belongs to no single pack, no single alpha. She is the bridge between worlds, the one who will restore the old balance." I belong to myself, Serena said, her golden eyes fixed on the massive black wolf who had dared to claim ownership of her destiny. And I choose him. The words seemed to hang in the morning air like a physical thing, and she watched as understanding dawned in the eyes of every supernatural creature present. This wasn't just a declaration of romantic preference. In the complex hierarchy of werewolf society, it was a binding that transcended pack loyalty and territorial claims. The healer has chosen, one of Constantine's wolves whispered, his mental voice carrying overtones of religious awe. The prophecy is fulfilled. What prophecy? Serena demanded, though part of her was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. It was Darius who replied, his silver eyes finding hers across the blood-soaked clearing as his massive wolf form began to shift back toward human shape. The prophecy that speaks of the return of the first healer, he said, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. The one who would emerge in the darkest hour to restore balance between the human and supernatural worlds. The one who would choose a mate not through pack politics or territorial advantage, but through the recognition of souls. That's impossible, Serena breathed, even as something deep within her began to resonate with the truth of his words. I'm nobody, nothing, just a girl who was thrown away. No, Darius said, now fully human again despite his nakedness and injuries. You're everything. You always have been. Your family didn't cast you out because you were cursed. They cast you out because they could sense what you truly were, and they were terrified of what that meant. He was walking toward her now, ignoring the 30 hostile wolves that still surrounded them, his silver eyes locked on her face with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. You are the daughter of the line that once stood between worlds, he continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The bloodline that was thought lost centuries ago when the last healer disappeared into legend. Your powers, your connection to all living things, your ability to calm the beast in any supernatural creature, these aren't aberrations. They're your birthright. And if that's true, she asked, though she could feel the truth of it singing in her bones, what happens now? Now, Darius said, reaching her at last and cupping her face in hands that trembled despite his apparent confidence. You choose, not because prophecy demands it, not because the packs require it, but because your heart knows what it wants. Around them, the clearing had gone silent. 30 enemy wolves, 3 allied ones, and the very forest itself seemed to hold its breath as they waited for her answer. Serena looked into Darius's silver eyes and saw her future reflected there. Not the lonely existence she had resigned herself to, not the cursed isolation her family had condemned her to, but something bright and fierce and entirely her own. I choose you, she said simply, her golden eyes never leaving his silver ones. Not because you're an alpha, not because of prophecy or politics or pack bonds. I choose you because when I was lost in the storm, you were the shelter I found. Because when I thought I was broken, you showed me I was perfect exactly as I am. The kiss that followed was gentle and fierce and full of promise. But it was the power that erupted from their joined hands that truly sealed their bond. A golden silver light that seemed to wash across the entire clearing like sunrise after the longest night. When it faded, Constantine and his pack were gone, vanished into the forest as silently as they had come. Only Marcus and the other 2 wolves remained, their heads bowed in genuine respect for what they had witnessed. So, Darius said, his forehead resting against hers as they both fought to catch their breath. What does the first healer want to do with the rest of eternity? Serena smiled, her golden eyes dancing with mischief and love and the promise of adventures yet to come. I want to learn what it means to be myself, she said. And I want you to teach me what it means to be yours. As the sun climbed higher over the Shadowmere Mountains, casting its light on a world subtly but permanently changed, two souls that had been searching for centuries finally found their home in each other.